Is Bitcoin to a million inevitable?
Oh, I'm going to say it's inevitable. I think it's a very high probabilistic situation if the amount of credit that has to be emitted to solve these problems happens. Of course, there's a risk that the population says, I don't want that. We want austerity. We want to tighten our belts. We want to live within our means, and we want to destroy a lot of businesses because that demand is fake. It was paid for by printed money, and so we have to extinguish that credit and go back to a more sustainable economy. That is a risk. A very big tail risk. I don't think it's going to happen, but that could happen.
The cryptocurrency market could experience significant changes in response to the 2024 U.S. election, with Bitcoin possibly on track to hit previously unheard-of heights. Some analysts, such as Arthur Hayes, the former CEO of BitMEX, believe this is only the beginning. Hayes recently predicted a surge in Bitcoin prices that may reach an incredible $1 million due to factors like inflation, fiscal policies, and growing tensions in the global economy. Hayes emphasized in his most recent interview that there will be instability and uncertainty following the election due to the rising U.S. debt and the government's expanding spending goals. Hayes says the government budget currently exceeds nominal GDP for interest payments, healthcare, and defense, suggesting more serious economic problems. He argues that as the U.S. and other major economies turn to stimulus packages, the resulting surge in liquidity could act as a powerful catalyst for Bitcoin's price. Hayes predicts that we could see Bitcoin hitting $100,000 to $250,000 by the end of 2025. Be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay up to date with our exclusive content. Enjoy the video.
I don't have a particular view on how many years in a particular cycle. My view is based on how much money is going to be printed at the end of the day. We know the Bitcoin technology is solid. Of course, there could be something that happens. That's not really the question here. The question is how much money is the United States going to print? How much is China going to print? How much is Japan going to print? How much is the Eurozone going to print? Those four economic blocks are the most important. And so if you have a view on that, then that should inform your view about the amount of credit that's available in the system that wants to find a home in a fixed supply asset with infinite duration, and that's Bitcoin. I mean, I think next year is going to be quite interesting. I would say my price target is between $100,000 to $250,000 for Bitcoin by the end of next year. I still think that we could get to $100,000 in 2025. I was going through their latest Treasury quarterly refunding announcements. And so the Treasury Department prepares a report to the TBAC, which is the Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee, which is made up of a lot of the large too big to fail banks. And so the Treasury, the state of the U.S. economy and spending and their outlook for bills and coupons. So in the latest report, they break out the top 4 spending items of the U.S. government. And so number 1 is health and health services, plus social health care for the poor, the sick, the indigent, the old. And then you have defense spending, Veterans Affairs, which is the U.S. government's military stuff, right? They're going to go bomb everybody around the world. That costs a lot of money. And then you have the Treasury's interest payments on the debt funding, the deficit to pay for those basically 4 line items in the spending bill. And so if you look at in total those 4 things or 5 things, they're all growing faster than nominal GDP. And so the economy is growing slower than the spending of the federal government. And so that's the problem. Now, there's a very easy way to fix this problem. And we saw this between 2020 to 2023, when Trump and Biden each did a stimulus program that was financed by the Fed. So the Fed did QE to pay for the Treasury's borrowing to hand out stimulus checks to everyone. Now, the contrast to what has happened from 2008 until 2020 in the United States, where I call it QE for rich people. The Fed does quantitative easing. Assets end up in rich people's hands, stockholders, there's buybacks. I know they buy expensive real estate, they buy art, whatever. But it doesn't end up in people who are actually going to spend it. And therefore, banks aren't going to lend money to companies to increase production because the majority of the U.S. population is no better off for quantitative easing. And what you see is a money multiplier of 1 and no real economic growth created and a rise in debt to GDP. But Trump and Biden changed that with the stimulus checks, where they handed out money to everyone. And what did people do? They're poor. They spent it all. And then what was the government doing at the same time? They were saying, hey, we want factories, we want green energy, we want it built here in America. We're going to provide tax credits and subsidies to companies who do this. And so what companies did, they put together the program, they applied for the money from the government, they went a regional bank, a non too big to fail bank, and they got a corporate loan. And so if you look at the amount of loans issued by small to medium-sized banks in the United States from 2020 to 2022, you see a market increase, even as the Fed is raising rates, because there's real demand that companies need to increase production for because the government's paying for it. And so you saw the debt to GDP ratio actually fall. The US government deleveraged because nominal GDP growth was running so hot. Obviously, inflation ran hot alongside it, but the government is actually deleveraging itself. So we have QE for rich people, 2008 to 2020, QE for poor people, 2020 to 2022, and then the bondholders revolted, and so they went back to QE for rich people, 2022 until the present.
According to Arthur Hayes, the goal of the U.S. government's reindustrialization strategy will be to return supply chains back to the U.S. and Western Europe from China. Massive investments would be needed to make this change, possibly financed by industrial policies and quantitative easing, which could raise inflation. According to Hayes, Bitcoin would benefit greatly from an inflationary climate, which might drive its price to $1 million. He also expects that other major economies like Western Europe, China, and Russia will follow similar reindustrialization strategies, further contributing to global inflation. Hayes argues that budget cuts are unlikely because they would risk destabilizing the economy. When it comes to altcoins, Hayes favors Ethereum over Solana for the next 12 to 18 months. He highlights Ethereum's potential for greater transaction volumes and reduced fees, suggesting it could outperform Solana, although he doesn't have a specific price target for Ethereum. Now, let's dive deeper into the interview to hear more of Arthur Hayes' thoughts.
Now, the problems with the US government are pretty intractable, right? They outsource the entire manufacturing base to China, and now the United States plus NATO, who have a combined GDP of 22 times that of Russia, cannot beat them in Ukraine. And so that means that the United States needs to reindustrialize so that they can produce more weapons to go and f people up, right? That's what America does. And that means that every single supply chain thing that comes from China needs to go back to America or Western Europe. And that's extremely expensive because if you look, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but if you think about the trillions of US dollars of bank credit that China provided to real industry to build the things that are necessary to make the products that make them the workshop of the world, that's in the single digit to tens of trillions of US dollars of bank credit. The United States needs to do the same thing, and they need to do it faster because they have wars to win. And so that's why I think that QE for poor people, which means industrial policy, bank credit for favorite industries, semiconductors, manufacturing firms, weapons dealers, those type of folks, and treasury handouts so that people can afford their healthcare. That's what's coming, and it's going to be massive. So that's why I think that in the medium term, Trump or Harris has to do these things. They're not saying, hey, I'm going to stop doing wars. They're not saying, hey, old people, you're not getting any more healthcare. And so this is the only way to pay for it. And the only way to pay for it where the economy is actually growing and the government is deleveraging itself is to do QE for rich people. And if you looked at the amount of dollars that were emitted between 2020 to 2022, in the stimulus programs, 40% of all dollars that were ever created were created in those 2 years. And so QE for poor people is massively inflationary. And we all know what happened to Bitcoin. What was it, 3,000 to 69,000 at the top of that bull market. So I think we're going to see an insane upside price potential for Bitcoin as the United States pursues this policy. And obviously this isn't done in a vacuum. Western Europe needs to do the same thing to beef up their security. China and Russia aren't going to sit around and not do it as well. And so everyone's doing the same thing. No one's really saying I'm going to do austerity, balance the budget. No one's trying to be like Argentina. If you look at Argentina, yeah, they balanced the budget, but industrial production was down 20% recently. So that's a revolution right there if you have that in any sort of fractional banking society like the US or China.
Is Bitcoin to $1 million inevitable?
Oh, I'm going to say it's inevitable. I think it's a very high probabilistic situation if the amount of credit that has to be emitted to solve these problems happens. Of course, there's a risk that the population says, I don't want that. We want austerity. We want to tighten our belts. We want to live within our means, and we want to destroy a lot of businesses because that demand is fake. It was paid for by printed money, and so we have to extinguish that credit and go back to a more sustainable economy. That is a risk. A very big tail risk. I don't think it's going to happen, but that could happen.
Arthur Hayes warns on the serious issues the U.S. government is facing, especially its reliance on Chinese manufacturing outsourcing. He contends that the United States must reindustrialize, moving the manufacturing of vital products like weaponry, semiconductors, and other vital industries back to America or Western Europe in order to preserve its economic and military dominance. However, as China has done over the years to develop its own industrial base, this reindustrialization would be very expensive, requiring trillions of dollars in fresh bank borrowing. Hayes believes that this massive investment will likely be funded through a combination of quantitative easing, QE, and industrial policies, essentially printing money to finance these projects. He refers to this as QE for poor people, referring to how the government will use bank credit to fund essential industries and distribute funds to the public through programs like healthcare handouts. Hayes, however, notes that inflation will unavoidably result from this. He believes that this inflationary climate will be extremely beneficial for Bitcoin, and that its price may rise as a result of this economic strategy, much like it did between 2020 and 2022 when significant stimulus measures caused the price of Bitcoin to soar. Finally, Hayes expresses a high level of confidence that Bitcoin could hit $1 million if these policies play out. Until next time, happy investing.